Well, hello again, and we're back, streaming to you live on Vito. We've had a great session from Purim from the BBC this morning, and still to come, we have talks from Ian Piper about content graphs, Bryn Ray about systems thinking, and David Bailey about technical authoring planning, and more besides. It's great to see so many people from so far away come to World IA Day this year. We have people from the Philippines, from Australia. We may even do a prize, for the furthest person away. We have a few giveaways. Oh, which reminds me, yes, this may be a free community conference, but you come to a conference, you want a goodie bag, don't you? Even if it's over Zoom. So, if you haven't already, bit.ly/WIAD21-gifts is your go-to link for a lovely little goodie bag of discounts and free trials. We've got, what have we got in here? Gosh, we've got some interesting things. We've got money off the 2021 Information Architecture Conference, if you will, the big brother to World IA Day. We've got a free trial of Proto.io, 60-day license, in fact. We've got money off Abby Covert, your friend and mine, author of How to Make Sense of Any Mess. Her Etsy shop has 15% off with this goodie bag. We've got a 90-day extended subscription to the UX testing platform, which is amazing. And 20% off anything from Rosenfeld Media. So be sure to grab your little goodie bag of conference swag there, digital swag. And now it's back to me. Right, what's next? So organized, aren't we? Yes, Ioannis Nousis is a product designer at Google, where he's literally putting local businesses on the map. He's worked in a lot of different product places, from with a background in e-commerce and fintech and helping startups to scale up. So he's seen, well, a lot of that so-called minimum viable product. It's seen a lot of those developed, and sometimes without the necessary thinking to make them a success. So Ioannis believes that applying design thinking to the MVP process helps keep out internal stakeholder bias, and it saves time and money when we validate our hypotheses early. As before, if you have any questions for Ioannis during the talk, please post them in the chat. We want to get as much discussion going as we can. And after the talk, I'll pick out some of the best ones. There may be a prize for the most upvoted questions today. So, if all is ready, and I see on my monitor that it is, let's go over now to Ioannis Nousis to tell us how to use design thinking to maximize the value of an MVP.
Hello. Hi. Thank you, Mike. First of all, Mike, Maria, and the team for making this event happen. Just before I start echoing what Mike said, I agree. What a great way to start the conference with a talk from Purim earlier, with some really good insights about curiosity and having a holistic view to be able to find answers and collaborate together. So again, hello everyone. Hopefully you can hear me all right. I had some issues with my Bluetooth headphones. Hopefully now should be fine. And thanks for tuning in today on this really lovely Saturday morning. Hope everyone is staying safe and healthy in those difficult times. But yeah, let's start. So, hi, I'm Ioannis. I'm an interaction designer at Google. I work on Google Maps here in London. And today I'd like to share with you a method that I have been using for some time now, which has helped me in my design journey so far to build products that are not based on biases. They achieve product market fit and address real customer needs. First, I'm going to set the context a little bit and then talk about the method itself. So Having started my digital product design career in startups, I've become a big fan of the lean startup movement, and I love the underlying principle of testing, learning, and pivoting by experimenting with the most basic prototypes. I remember the first time I came across a three-letter abbreviation, the biggest buzzword in the tech industry, the minimum viable product, aka the MVP. And if you Google it, you will get around 280 million results. That's how popular it is. Back then, I was surprised by the idea of shipping um, and learning, especially because coming from an industrial design background, this was not how I was used to design products. But since then, I have had many conversations with UX, product, and engineering folks about MVPs and their overall value. And I have seen that people have become allergic to this word because of its preconceived notions. And sometimes I wonder, can you blame them? I'm pretty sure that we are all familiar with this scenario. The CEO liked the idea of the MVP, didn't really understand it, and said, great, that's what we should do. Um, and that's how we should do the product that I envisioned. And then suddenly there's a product team that is tasked to solve a problem that we don't even know if it addresses real user needs in the first place. And in addition, you will often hear that there is not enough time for research and not enough time to properly explore design ideas. And quite frankly, you're just pressured to get a product which is based on biases and assumptions out the door as quickly as possible. And halfway through the project, after you spend a significant time designing and getting buy-in about your designs, your team finds out that the MVP is far more difficult to implement and decides to cut corners just to hit the deadline. And 99% of the time, what this means is that the team would be cutting corners on important functionality. Just going from the V0 and V1 and V2, and those two will come later in later iterations. And the result, basically, the shipped product is a half-baked product that we are not always very proud of, and users find it confusing. In most cases, that MVP lives in production for 1 or 2 years until someone else joins the company and tries to fix it. And what about the learnings? Surely that wasn't for nothing. Well, we've learned that some of the core assumptions we were making were not true, but it's already too late. The cost of changing the shipped product is way bigger. What happens is that we build on top of it with spaghetti code and clunky information architecture. But what about the fail fast and learn fast mentality that everyone is talking about in the startup world? Well, I think that's the biggest misconception about the MVP. And one could ask then, are the MVPs the wrong way to build products? Well, fundamentally no. Eric Ries, who coined the term MVP, in his book, The Lean Startup, he defines an MVP as something that allows the team to collect the maximum amount of validated learning about customers with the least effort. What I have seen, though, in most cases, is the exact opposite. We focus too much on the assumptions about the system and the user needs instead of thinking about what do we really need to learn before moving forward and building the product. The reason why MVPs fail is not because they don't work, it's because we are using them wrong. And we let our own biases, or even worse, the HIPPO's biases, affect the product that we're building? Well, not those hippos, but those hippos, the highest paid person opinions, where oftentimes we feel powerless to counter their arguments. Because usually we don't have the research to back it up, as a result of there is no time for it, or because research is too expensive, or my worst argument of all time, when the CEO comes and says, I know what users want. So I found a tool that has helped me tackle this problem. It didn't make the product bulletproof, but rather helped me manage my stakeholder biases, both at Google and previous companies, and has helped the teams I was working with build confidence in the viability of our ideas. And I'd like to dive deeper and share this experience with you. But first, let's lay some context. So, in the UX field, there are a number of rules that you might have heard of, known as the UX rules. One of those is Occam's razor, and Occam being a philosopher and theologian in the 1800s. What this rule says is that among competing hypotheses that predict equally well, the one with the fewest assumptions should be selected. And why is that important? Well, because everything we design is based on ideas, and those ideas are influenced by our own biases, the biases of our team and our stakeholders, and on how we think users will react to our ideas. So the fewer assumptions we have about our solutions or concepts, the better our designs will accommodate our users' mental models, and thus create an experience that aligns with their needs. So I'd like to introduce the riskiest assumptions framework. You'll be rightfully thinking right now, how do you know which assumption to test? You might have 10 or 15 or 20 assumptions for a specific feature, let alone the product itself. A few years ago, I came across the concept of riskiest assumptions testing by Eric Hickam, where he discusses that the key is rapid, small tests. What's the smallest experiment you can make to test your biggest assumption? Or in other words, as Tom Chi, the co-founder of Google X, puts it, how can you maximize the rate of learning by minimizing the time to try things? And once you've validated the riskiest assumption, you can then move on to the next larger one. This way, you will be gradually building confidence in your ideas. But hold on, how do you know which assumption is the riskiest one? For that, let's talk about the business world for a little bit. And I'd like to quote Don Norman to help me on this one. So he says that in order to understand products, it is not enough to understand design or technology. It is crucial to understand business. And okay, that sounds reasonable, but what does it actually mean? Well, it's not the type of dilemma of whether or not designers should learn how to code or have an MBA. Actually, it's quite far from it. What it means is that since we are working for a business, we have to understand how risk is defined in the business world. So let me shed some light really quickly on this one. So risk is nothing more than the quantitatively defined impact of an event times the also quantitatively defined probability of that event occurring. Or in simple words, risk equals impact times the probability. So why was that previous bit important, I hear you ask? Well, it's very crucial to the next part, which is actually the tool itself, the Riskiest Assumptions Canvas. And inspired by the Canvas frameworks from service design, I created this canvas based on several iterations while doing this in my previous companies, but also at Google as well. So here's how it works. In the previous companies that I worked at, when trying to use the Riskiest Assumptions framework, I observed that my team and I would get blocked on how to start coming up with riskiest assumptions. What I saw as a common behavior was that people would start randomly creating their assumptions in post-it notes and then trying to cluster them into groups together. There will be duplications of those groups, for example, because two people would create the same category and then we would have to consolidate it into one. And generally, it was time consuming to make sure that every assumption would fit in a group. That was especially true when we were thinking about new products that we wanted to build. So what I observed was that oftentimes we would come up with the same categories again and again. And what I did was I started using predefined categories to help jumpstart that process. And it was then when I realized that I can use those predefined categories in some sort of canvas type tool, which then can be used as a springboard to generate assumptions quickly with my team. So for example, I found that sometimes we didn't have a clear idea of who the end users would be for our new product, or which specific segment of users are we targeting. That's why I would usually have a group called customers, which then made it easy to start generating assumptions. Another reason why I decided to create those predefined categories was to remind my team that we should come back to that canvas and work on our assumptions for different stages of the design process, such as when brainstorming solutions or when defining our MVP. But of course, the canvas can be adjusted to fit the needs of any team, especially if the product is already an existing one. So how can you use this tool? Well, step one is to gather your main stakeholders in one room or virtual room nowadays and map all your assumptions that are vital to your product. I do this in two ways. One way, I ask them questions about what the problem that we're trying to solve is and why, who our customers are, what type of insights do we have from speaking to sales or customer support. Think of this like ask the expert session when you're running design sprints. Then cluster those assumptions into different groups. As I mentioned before, I have seen some common patterns when clustering those groups together. So the canvas has, as I said, some predefined categories, but you can adjust based on your own findings. So going back to the canvas, you would have to write your assumptions for categories like customers, where you would think about who are your customers? How do they use your product? What value do they get from the current product solution? What's their core job to be done? Then there's a section about the problem. In that section, think about whether or not you have identified a pain point for your target customers. What are they missing from your current product? What are they currently doing to mitigate that problem or even solve it? Do they have a workaround for it? Then about solutions, think about how would your proposed solutions solve your customer's problem? Then about the MVP, what is the MVP solution that your customers are willing to pay for? And then there's another section, another category about competition, and think about who else is providing this solution. What is their competitive advantage? What is your competitive advantage? Or think about the sales channels. Think about again, like, will you sell your product or service online? Is it inside sales, outside sales? Is it distribution? And then step 2. This is the fun bit and the most important one as well. In this step, you have to think about the probability and the impact of each assumption that you come up with and score them based on the formula that we talked about before, where again, risk equals probability times the impact. And here we have 2 factors. The first factor is probability, and it's on a scale of 1 to 5. This is where you score the probability of your assumption being wrong. And this is quite interesting because it's like an inverse confidence rating. So what it means is that the less confident you are about your assumption, the higher the number. But why inverse confidence? Well, in good scientific experiments, researchers should seek to falsify their hypotheses, not confirm them, because there's a high risk of basically running into one of the most trickiest cognitive biases, the information bias. In other words, our human tendency to cherry pick information that confirms our existing beliefs. But hold on, how can you define confidence? Well, that's a great question. I've found that the only way to calculate confidence is by looking for supporting evidence. And to do that, you can use a tool called the confidence wheel, which what I have here is inspired by Ioannis Nousis, who's an ex-Googler. When using this tool, consider what signals do you have already and what do you need to do next to gain more confidence. So as you see, when an assumption has a probability score of 5 or 4, we have basically zero confidence because we know nothing about it. It could be a finger in the air or a gut feeling or just a personal opinion. A probability score of 3 can be signals that you have from either market trends or competitor research with products that have similar features, and thus, assuming that people who use that competitor product have similar needs. However, just because, say, Apple is doing it or someone else, it doesn't mean that it's true for your product too. That's why the probability of being wrong is still relatively high. A score of 2 is when you have research findings that are based on user testing or survey data, or even from users requesting specific features or expressing, a pain point of theirs. That's when there's a high chance that this assumption that you're making might be actually true. So the probability score is relatively low. And finally, a score of 1 is when you are completely certain that you have evidence from either multiple user studies or from A/B test experiments, or even when you have quantitative data that are coming from analytics in production. So generally, if the probability score for an assumption is low, example, it's 1 or 2, then just be aware that most likely this is not going to be a riskiest assumption. Now, the second factor is impact. And impact is scored on a scale of 1 to 10. And impact is about how much your assumption can have an impact on the product given your goals. And this could be a combination of engineering work for a solution and or how much you think this will address your users' needs. For example, it could be how much it will increase adoption, or how much it will delight users, or how much is going to take the engineering team to implement that proposed solution. Once you're done with those two factors, then you're ready to calculate the total risk score for every assumption that you have made. You should then have a prioritized list of riskiest assumptions for each theme or category that you've created in step one. So now it's time for you and your team to validate or disprove basically those assumptions. And you have many options to do that. You can run surveys, or you can do concept testing with a design artifact and probe participants specifically about those assumptions. But let's look at an example. I'll use the Riskiest Assumption Canvas for this example. So let's say, hypothetically, that you have this brief, and or it's a newly created business, and you're chatting with the CEO, and the idea is to build an app that a person can use to build relationships with their neighbors. Great. Going back to the canvas, first step is to map all the assumptions that are vital to the product and cluster them into groups. Again, here I'm using a canvas as it already has some predefined categories, which can help me kickstart this work. And just for the purpose of this example, I'm just going to use customers as a category of choice and add a few assumptions there. All right, so in this category, I'm focusing on who are the customers using this app. How would they use the product? What value would they get from it? How are they feeling about this perceived, let's say, in this point, pain point? In this case, I've already went ahead and I've came up with 4 different assumptions for the customers of this product. So first assumption is that customers would use an app as a way to connect with their neighbors. The second assumption is that customers find it difficult to build relationships with their neighbors. Third assumption is that customers find it hard to discover what's on their neighborhood. And fourth assumption is that customers feel safer in the local area if they know who their neighbors are. Again, random assumptions here. So the next step is to score each assumption based on the probability and impact, as we talked before. So for the probability factor, my first and third assumption are scored as a 5, as I have 0 data about them, and I don't know if they're true or not at all. Basically, it's a finger in the air. The second and fourth assumptions are scored a bit lower with a probability score of 3, as I found some data in a few public surveys related to the difficulty in building relationships in the neighborhood, which raised my confidence a little bit. And then for the second factor, I'm thinking about impact. So I scored the first assumption with a 10 and the fourth assumption with an 8, because if these 2 assumptions are wrong, then there is a risk that people won't be using the app, which basically translates to having no product market fit. I also scored the second assumption with a 6 and the third assumption with a 4, as there are other ways to discover what events are taking place in your local area. For example, by reading the local newspaper or the local magazine for that reason. And the next step is to calculate the risk. So for each assumption, based on the formula that we talked about earlier, and that is risk equals probability times impact. So the assumptions As a general rule, the assumptions with a higher score are also the riskiest assumptions. And this means that I should focus my research efforts on validating or disproving those assumptions first when it comes to, to the customer's category for the product. And just to keep things neat and tidy, after I have applied the risk score, I order the list from highest to lowest. So I would rinse and repeat and apply the same method for the other categories too. What the results should look like is a prioritized list of riskiest assumption for each category in the canvas. This helps you and your team craft a research plan that revolves around the things that have an immediate impact on the product success and can make or break the product. And you can identify those very early on. So, some takeaways. So, the riskiest assumption canvas helps you and your team to have a product that is not biased. So you'll be able to design products that are aligned with your customers' mental models and their needs by validating your riskiest assumptions early on and not build products that are based on gut feeling and personal opinions from different stakeholders. Also, it will help you to get it right with fewer iterations. As you test your riskiest assumptions, you will be increasing your confidence in the product that you're building. After each research study, you will have the evidence that shows you whether or not the product is heading in the right direction, which means that you have higher chances to achieve product market fit and customer acceptance. Also, it will help you to fail fast with lower risk as a business. You'll be able to learn much faster and safer. Because people in the startup will say, fail fast. But not all failure is created equal. What is actually happening in a lot of cases is that the whole company fails from putting too much confidence in something that wasn't properly defined. You'll be able to fail fast on your MVP prototype and not create an engineering monster that will stay in production for years. Also, you'll be able to learn with less headcount, especially with engineering, saving resources and then setting up the business for success. And finally, it will help you to collaborate and make decisions together as a team. Using design thinking and facilitating a riskiest assumption workshop for you and your team, you have an opportunity to bring everyone together, from designers, researchers, PMs, tech leads, and engineers, and involve them in the decision making from the very start. You get buy-in and you reduce the communication friction. Also, I want to leave you with some tips when using the Riskiest Assumption Canvas. So here they go. Tip number one, remember to educate your team about what Riskiest Assumptions Workshop is and what the value it will bring to the team. In my past experience, there have been many times where people had been unfamiliar with the term riskiest assumptions, what it means, how it works, and what value it can bring to the design process and ultimately to the product. I've found that it's very helpful to introduce the framework to my team first, either by having a brief discussion or a presentation where I would show them past examples of how it's done and what the impact was. Now, there might be cases where you don't have past examples. Again, though, it's still worth having a brief chat with the team about the framework and explaining why you want to use it, and the benefits that you will have. And maybe what you could do is have a fake brief and present how it would work, just like we did today. Tip number 2 is to remember to use categories to organize your assumptions. Again, from my past experience, I have found that my team and I would feel blocked and not knowing how or where to start with gathering those assumptions. So using predefined categories helps to jumpstart the process and get those ideas flowing. Tip number 3 is to remember to think of evidence when you're scoring your assumptions. And one thing that has helped me while scoring the probability of an assumption has been definitely the confidence wheel, especially with the more vocal stakeholders. I always make sure I have it, front and center so that everyone can see. And for each assumption that we score, I ask, what evidence do you have? So use the confidence wheel as a reference and try it out with your team, and have the mindset of thinking about any quantitative or qualitative data you might have collected in the past through either user interviews, surveys, testing sessions, market trends, or even competitor data. This will help you set your confidence on whether an assumption might be true or not, and define the risk status of each assumption. Tip number 4, remember to change the scoring after the research is done. So after you have done the research study and you've validated or disproved your assumptions, your level of confidence will change in light of the new findings. So once your research is done, remember to change the scoring in the assumptions canvas as well, so that it's up to date and you can track the progress. And finally, tip number 5. Remember to review your canvas and work on your assumptions on different stages of the product lifecycle. The predefined categories could work as a reminder to come back to the Riskiest Assumption Canvas and review your assumptions that you've already made and make additional ones if needed at later stages of the process, such as when you're brainstorming solutions and when you are defining the MVP. And that's it. Please find me on LinkedIn, Twitter, or shoot me an email. You found that this is interesting. Yeah, it was very nice talking to you.
Thanks so much, Ioannis. Awesome stuff there. And sorry to anyone if my microphone was a little hot towards the end of Ioannis's talk there. Haven't done this before. We have a question in from SB. And SB writes, I find that assumptions are sometimes conflated with hypotheses in product conversations. Is it useful to separate the two? And any thoughts on how you would do this if so?
Yeah, that's a great question. I found that basically a hypothesis, and I found that those two terms are actually, yes, interchangeable sometimes by different people. But what I consider hypothesis is something that is based on some evidence. Like, for example, when you write a hypothesis is that you say, for example, we believe that by doing X, we'll have a result of Y, and we will know that this is true if we see Z, and all that. So that's how I would perceive a hypothesis. Is basically a statement that is more full, let's say, and has some evidence, but assumptions are just, I would say, I don't want to say ideas, but they are many levels lower of what hypotheses are. It's just opinions, and basically if those opinions can be paired with evidence, then you have assumptions that are basically true. So they're not basically assumptions, they're facts. And then you have assumptions that basically you have zero confidence. So what an assumption is just opinions that you don't really know if they're true or not.
Thanks, Ioannis. Dennis asks, after you develop the canvas, do you ever come up with assumptions outside of the categories on the canvas?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So it has happened before. Usually, when I would come back to the canvas would be when brainstorming solutions or working on the MVP, and there I might create like small subset of categories inside of the big category of solutions. So say, for example, a solution might be to have filters, and then after and then under the solution of having filters for whatever reason, then you might have sub assumptions that you also like to test. So it's nice if you can map all your solutions on assumptions and then validate those, because then you can, if someone says, I believe we should do that, you can say, hey, actually, we've tested that assumption and we know that this is not true. And then what you've achieved is that you've created something that that works well for users. So, this is how you kind of create that product value that I was talking about.
Super. Martina asks, do you have any thoughts on the concept or idea of a MLP, a minimum lovable product?
Yeah, I think that's just semantics. I mean, I would say, by shameless plug, but I would say that if you do the Riskiest Assumption Canvas, you might end up with a minimum lovable product, because even if you cut corners, because I found that 99.999% of the time when you're launching something, you are cutting corners for whatever reason. But even if you do though, and you have done the Riskiest Assumption Canvas, you will know that even that MLV that is out there, it's still far better than what you would have if you didn't do it.
Awesome. I'm going to ask a question if I can.
Yeah.
Often with an MVP, you're attaching metrics to measure the success of that, or to define what success looks like. How would you go about picking the right metrics and making sure that they're not sort of gamed, if you like, to sort of
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah. I mean, when I see vanity metrics, I always kind of raise a red flag and say, do we really want to have that as a, as a success metric? But I found that the best way to avoid that is by at least having done some foundational research beforehand, or any type of, again, foundational research, and knowing what the user needs are, what the pain points are, so that you can then map them against some success metrics. Because if you say our success metric is to get the NPS score up, I mean, sure, yes. What does this really tell you? I don't know. So I would say, you should come up with success metrics that are able to tell a story that you've done something and you have some impact to your product.
Cool. Thank you.
No worries.
Well, that was a fabulous presentation, Ioannis. Thanks so much for taking the time there.
Great. Thank you for having me. Thank you. And everyone who tuned in.
Absolute pleasure. Now, you might be able to see behind me here a Finger Beauty, which is our Miro board that has been very kindly created for us by Alex. And coincidentally, it's time for our first World IA Day giveaway. And there's going to be a few of these throughout the day, but I think the first one is going to go to Alex, because I mean this thing is a labor of love, and it's something that you can all contribute to during the talk. So if you just scroll down in the stream, perhaps someone could repost the link up to the top. You should all be able to get access to it, and it's a sort of shareable pasteboard sketch note environment for capturing all the insights today. So thanks to Alex there. You win, I have here, an ebook bundle from Rosenfeld Media. So a couple of ebooks from Rosenfeld there. We'll get your details and send them off, and they will be in touch. So keep your questions coming throughout the day. Keep the conversation going. We're going to wrap up now for lunch. because, 12:30 and all, 12:05, sorry, going mad. Yeah, we will be back here at 12:30, according to my schedule here, where we will be hearing from Ian Piper, who's going to talk about content graphs, knowledge graphs, that kind of thing. So it's sure to be a real good, in the weeds IA talk. So that's it from us for this morning. Please go and grab lunch. I'm sorry we can't cater it for you. We will be back here at 12:30, live in your living room. See you then.